Hi, this is Morley and this is the M-Wire. In this video, we are going to look at President Trump signs an executive order that bans critical race theory being taught in universities and workplaces. But before I do that, thank you to my new subscribers. I love and appreciate you. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so as it would greatly help out the channel. So before I get into the video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain what critical race theory is, as there seems to be some confusion as to its definition. Critical race theory, the view that the law and legal institutions are inherently racist and that race itself, instead of being biologically grounded and natural, is a socially constructed concept that is used by white people to further their economic and political interests at the expense of people of color. According to critical race theory, CRT, racial inequality emerges from the social, economic, and legal differences that white people create between races to maintain elite white interests in labor markets and politics, giving rise to poverty and criminality in many minority communities. The CRT movement officially organized itself in 1989 at the first annual workshop on critical race theory, though its intellectual origins go back much further, in the 1960s and 1970s. So now you know where all the people crying systemic racism and white privilege are getting it from. They seem to be under the impression that by simply being white, white people somehow lead a charmed life with anything they want is theirs for the asking. Then why are there white homeless people and white underprivileged kids? Yes, they actually do exist. If that were true, there wouldn't be any black doctors, lawyers, judges, and other people of color having positions of high status in our society. They all have one thing in common. They were willing to work hard and overcome obstacles to get where they are today. That is why it is more important than ever to promote people based on their ability and content of their character rather than how much pigment is or isn't in their skin or their gender. CRT is indoctrination. It's something that has no basis and is a falsehood at best. The importance of Trump's executive order cannot be overstated. Let's get into this. Order banning critical race theory doctrine will rock universities across the country. As reported yesterday by my Red State colleague Nick Arama, on Tuesday, President Trump unveiled an executive order directed at the advocacy of left-wing interest groups of dogmatic pseudo-political science and revisionist history that generically falls into the classification of studies referred to as critical race theory. The executive order defines what it refers to as divisive concepts and subject matter under reviews as follows. Divisive concepts means that the concepts that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex, the United States is fundamentally sexist or racist, an individual by virtue of his race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously, an individual that should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race or sex. Members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. An individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or race or sex. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his race or sex. Mediocrity or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist or were created by a particular race to oppress another race. Now, I just want you to imagine the left reading what I've just read and just imagine the shock and horror to their very soul. They're hitting the roof reading this, folks. They really are. Anyone contracting with the federal government must certify that it does not use any workplace training materials that advocate such divisive concepts. Non-compliance can result in the cancellation of the federal contract. The heads of all government agencies that issue grant funds must contact all grant fund recipients and obtain a certification that the recipient will not use any federal funds to advocate the teaching of divisive concepts. The head of each agency of the executive branch shall take steps to ensure that the agency employees, while on duty status, or any contracts hired by the agency to provide training, workshops, forums, or similar programming to agency employees, do not teach or advocate the divisive concepts. If any contractor is to have violated the prohibition by teaching or advocating the divisive concepts, the agency that contracted for such training shall evaluate whether to pursue debarment of that contractor. The Attorney General should determine the extent to which workplace training that teaches the divisive concepts may contribute to a hostile work environment and give rise to potential liability under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting workplace discrimination. The timing of the announcement was pretty cagey. 2 weeks ago, the White House put out a directive to all federal agencies to stop any training that was taking place on subjects generally within the scope of critical race theory. But the former EEO issued today clearly goes much farther, and the Democrat media race huckster outcry is certainly going to be muffled by the issue of a nominee to replace Justice Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. This will certainly trigger many legal challenges right away, but it might be difficult to get preliminary injunctive relief as to either contractors or grant recipients until some form of adverse action is taken by a government agency. As it stands, there is no irreparable injury to anyone until a violation of the EO established and contract grant is canceled as a result. And even then, because contracts and grants involve only monetary losses, there is an argument that can be made that any injury to the recipient is compensatable in monetary damages and injunctive relief if not warranted. There is provision later in the EO that attempts for the prohibition of teaching of divisive concepts as part of a larger course of instruction by an academic institution. So the teaching of critical race theory at universities will probably not be impacted, but any university president will be playing with fire to the extent the university receives substantial federal grant funding and has an active critical race theory advocacy program as part of their academic program or employee workplace education program. The risk to K-12 schools, districts, and local governments is significant because federal grant monies from the Department of Education and other federal agencies go out to them as well. It's possible, and maybe even likely, that the intention is more prophylactic than remedial. The administration will certainly put a stop to the teaching of divisive concepts to the federal workforce and military. Whether the administration really intends to take the EO to a step further with aggressive enforcement and against private parties such as contractors and grant recipients remains to be seen. But any voluntary compliance with the restrictions is movement in the right to staunch the flow of pernicious form of racial victimology. It will also likely put a dent in the burgeoning cottage industry of race hucksters who promote and live off nonsense like NYT 1619 Project. Corporate America has already been co-opted to fund so much of this advocacy, at least to the extent that George Soros doesn't fund it. But those same corporations and also do business with the government have instruction for their employees on divisive concepts are going to need to pause to consider how they avoid running afoul of the EO. I think I'm starting to see some business opportunities here. Needless to say, this is going to set the left on its ear. No more teaching this nonsense in universities, as well as not having to go to race sensitivity training or some other ilk in the workplace. Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you very much for coming along to my video. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It would greatly help out the channel. And God bless you all.